British Columbia announced that the U.S. government has paused negotiations on the expansive Columbia River Treaty, saying the current administration is reviewing its international engagement.
The deadly and devastating wildfires in Los Angeles are drawing new attention to U.S. President-elect Donald Trump's comments about one of Canada's most valued natural resources.
Water has never been more political. Donald Trump stunned both Americans and Canadians when he declared that Canada's massive freshwater reserves should be tapped like a faucet for the U.S.
We have millions of gallons of water pouring down from the north with the snow caps in Canada and all pouring down. And they have essentially a very large faucet.
But when Prime Minister Mark Carney fired back, saying Canada's water is off limits, it set off more than a war of words. This clash isn't just about rivers and lakes. It's about sovereignty, climate change, and whether America can force its neighbor to share the most vital resource on Earth. Canada controls nearly a fifth of the world's surface freshwater, concentrated in the Great Lakes, the St. Lawrence River, and an endless network of northern lakes. That sheer abundance makes it both an environmental treasure and a strategic prize. So when Donald Trump described it as a very large faucet that the U.S. could simply turn on to solve its own shortages, the remark struck a nerve. In California alone, water scarcity has already cost farmers billions in recent years, and across the American Southwest, reservoirs like Lake Mead have fallen to historic lows. To Trump, Canada's reserves looked like the solution. But Canadians have been here before. In the 1990s, controversial proposals to export bulk water south ignited a nationwide uproar, leading Ottawa to outlaw such schemes. Laws now explicitly block large-scale diversions, yet Trump's push revived old anxieties, this time against the backdrop of worsening climate change. With rising demand in the U.S. and tightening supply at home, what once sounded like political posturing now feels like a looming geopolitical dispute, one that immediately places long-standing cross-border agreements under the microscope. For over a century, the backbone of U.S.-Canada water relations has been a series of treaties designed to prevent exactly the kind of conflict Trump is now stirring. The 1909 Boundary Waters Treaty created the International Joint Commission, a binational body that still oversees shared waters. Later came the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement and the 2008 Great Lakes Compact, which collectively safeguard nearly 20% of the planet's surface freshwater. These frameworks are not symbolic. They are legally binding, and they keep both countries from diverting or exploiting shared waters without mutual consent. The numbers reveal just how vital these agreements are. The Great Lakes alone provide drinking water for over 40 million people, power hydroelectric plants across Ontario and the Midwest, and support an economy valued at more than $6 trillion annually. Even small disruptions in water management could threaten shipping, industry, and the health of an ecosystem that scientists say is already under stress from pollution, invasive species, and warming temperatures. That's why Trump's talk of bypassing or scrapping these treaties landed like a shockwave. It wasn't just a question of rhetoric, it hinted at unraveling the very mechanisms that have kept the two countries cooperating for generations. Trump's comments didn't just rattle politicians, they lit a fire under environmental groups, academics, and local leaders who've spent decades protecting the Great Lakes. Organizations like FLOW, Alliance for the Great Lakes, and Milwaukee Riverkeeper quickly warned that framing Canada's water as an American resource risked undoing years of fragile cooperation. They pointed out that these watersheds are already under immense pressure. Invasive species like Asian carp threaten fisheries worth billions, while toxic algal blooms in Lake Erie have poisoned drinking water for entire cities, including Toledo, Ohio in 2014. Experts also stressed how unusual the Canada-US water relationship really is. Unlike many regions of the world where shared rivers lead to bitter disputes, the Great Lakes have been held up as a rare example of stable, binational stewardship. Researchers have even called it the most successful water governance model on Earth. That's precisely why the idea of undermining it feels so alarming. To many Canadians, Trump's words sounded less like negotiation and more like a threat, and that perception has fueled a new wave of unity across provinces that don't always agree on resource policy. While Trump's rhetoric grabbed headlines, the real damage to water security is happening quietly through budget cuts. His administration has already slashed funding for the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, a program credited with cleaning up toxic hotspots, fighting invasive species, and protecting drinking water for tens of millions. The initiative once had bipartisan support, receiving around $300 million annually. Under Trump's 2025 budget proposals, much of that funding has been gutted. Scientists warn this will cripple the ability to monitor pollution, restore wetlands, and control threats like zebra and quagga mussels that cost industries hundreds of millions every year. The environmental consequences are no less serious. In 2022, harmful algal blooms covered over 1,300 square miles of Lake Erie, and those outbreaks are only expected to worsen with climate change. Without steady funding, cities around the lakes could face more contaminated water crises, while shipping and fishing industries worth billions may lose their resilience. Critics have described the cuts as cataclysmic, arguing that undoing decades of cleanup now will only multiply costs down the line. For Canada, this reinforced the sense that its neighbor might not only demand more water, but also neglect its shared responsibility to protect it. Amid the uproar, Prime Minister Mark Carney delivered what many Canadians saw as a defining moment of leadership. When asked about Trump's remarks, he didn't mince words. Canada's water was not for sale, not for trade, and not for negotiation. For a country long overshadowed by its southern neighbor, this was more than a policy statement. It was a declaration of sovereignty. Carney's response struck a chord across Canada, where polls consistently show over 70% of citizens oppose bulk water exports. The firmness of his message mattered. Canada is a country that has often relied on diplomacy and compromise, especially with the US, its biggest trading partner. But this time, Carney framed water as part of the national identity, on par with defending Arctic sovereignty or managing its energy resources. His stance instantly silenced speculation that Canada might bend under economic pressure. Instead, it positioned Ottawa as the gatekeeper of one of the world's most critical resources, willing to draw a red line even at the risk of straining its most important relationship. For American farmers, especially in California and the Southwest, Carney's refusal hit like a cold shock. Agriculture in California alone uses about 80% of the state's developed water supply, and recurring droughts have already cost the region billions. In 2022, researchers estimated agricultural losses from water shortages at more than $1.7 billion, with crops like almonds, rice, and tomatoes suffering the most. Many growers had quietly hoped that political pressure might open the door to some form of cross-border water diversion. Carney's red line erased that prospect overnight. Industries that depend heavily on water are also on edge. Semiconductor manufacturing, for instance, is incredibly water-intensive. An average chip plant can consume 10 million gallons per day. With the U.S. pushing to expand domestic chip production, reliable water supply has become just as critical as subsidies and tax breaks. Energy production faces similar risks. Hydroelectric plants, nuclear cooling systems, and even natural gas operations all require enormous volumes of fresh water. Without access to Canada's reserves, the U.S. is left to confront its own scarcity head-on. That reality is forcing both farmers and industry leaders to rethink assumptions about growth, resilience, and the role of water in America's economic future. Trump's remarks and Canada's blunt rejection quickly spilled into the political arena. To his strongest supporters, Trump's tough talk fit his brand of unapologetic negotiation, demanding what America needs, no matter the pushback. But outside his base, the optics were less flattering. Many Americans saw the idea of treating Canada's water as a U.S. entitlement as heavy-handed, even reckless, especially given the long history of cooperative agreements that have kept both nations stable. In Canada, the reaction was even more unified. Politicians across party lines rallied behind Carney's stance, portraying water not just as a resource but as a pillar of national security. Polling suggested that Canadians overwhelmingly backed the idea of ring-fencing water rights, fearing that giving in to U.S. demands would open the floodgates to endless pressure. Meanwhile, ordinary people on both sides of the border began voicing anxieties about drinking water reliability. In places like Michigan and Ohio, where residents still remember the Flint water crisis, the thought of weakened agreements raised real fears about whether political squabbling could put public health at risk. What began as an offhand remark by Trump was now reshaping how citizens viewed sovereignty, fairness, and even their own leaders' credibility. As the standoff hardened, analysts began framing the issue in broader terms. Water as the new oil. For decades, energy defined geopolitics, shaping wars, alliances, and trade deals. Now, with climate change, driving droughts, and population growth pushing demand, water is stepping into that same role. Canada's firm refusal to share its reserves didn't just frustrate Washington, it elevated Ottawa's global leverage. Suddenly, countries in Europe and Asia began exploring new water resilience partnerships with Canada, from desalination technology exchanges to long-term supply agreements for industries heavily dependent on stable water access. The shift is striking when you consider the numbers. The United Nations projects that by 2030, global demand for fresh water will outstrip supply by 40%. In regions like the Middle East and South Asia, water shortages are already shaping foreign policy and fueling conflicts. Against that backdrop, Canada's stockpile of fresh water appears less like a natural feature and more like a geopolitical bargaining chip. Trump may have sparked the clash, but the deeper consequence is this. Water has officially entered the arena of strategic assets, forcing governments to view rivers and lakes with the same weight once reserved for oil fields and gas pipelines. The fallout from Trump's water demand went far beyond North America. In Europe, diplomats quietly questioned whether Washington was still committed to multilateral agreements. To them, threatening to walk away from long-standing water treaties looked like a broader signal that the U.S. might abandon cooperative frameworks when convenient. Meanwhile, in Asia, governments facing their own severe water challenges, like India, Pakistan, and China, took note of Canada's firm stance. Ottawa suddenly looked like a more predictable partner for research, trade, and even investment tied to water security. The financial world also reacted. Risk analysts began flagging political tensions around shared resources as a new factor in North American stability ratings. Investors are especially sensitive because water futures, a market first launched in California in 2020, have been climbing steadily as scarcity grows. The idea that North America, home to the Great Lakes, the largest freshwater system on Earth, could become politically unstable over water-rattled confidence. In effect, Trump's remarks turned a domestic drought problem into an international question of trust and credibility. By contrast, Carney's stance reinforced Canada's image as a responsible steward, willing to safeguard not just its own people, but a global commons. The clash over water has left both countries facing tough choices. For the U.S., the reality is unavoidable. Importing Canadian freshwater is politically dead. That leaves domestic solutions, expanding desalination plants, modernizing irrigation, and recycling wastewater. Each of these comes with enormous costs. A single large-scale desalination facility can cost billions to build and operate, while farmers already struggling with razor-thin margins face pressure to cut water use even further. Industries like tech and energy will also have to adapt, rethinking where and how they expand. Canada, meanwhile, is expected to tighten its own national water protections. Experts predict Ottawa may move toward a comprehensive water strategy, ensuring provincial and federal governments speak with one voice against future pressure. In doing so, Canada is signaling that its fresh water isn't just a resource, it's a strategic shield in a world where scarcity is shaping new lines of power. This confrontation has shown how quickly water, once taken for granted, can dominate politics and diplomacy. So here's the question. Is the world ready for water to replace oil as the defining struggle of the century? If you want more deep dives like this, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.